Okay. All right. Are we starting to settle at? Let's try to settle down quickly. Saw there was a line in the bathroom. Okay. Hi, everyone. Very excited today to take you through a tour of our second session today. It's developing MRV recommendations for marine CDR. We have Ken Buesseler from Woods Hole, Dave Koweek from Ocean Visions, Freya Chay from CarbonPlan, and Savita Bowman from ClearPath to talk, to speak a little bit today about our developing MRV recommendations. So in a pre-session meeting we had, I had such an enjoyable conversation with these four people, and we were going to have a different format, and it was so fun that I said, let's just give everybody 15 minutes. So it's a little bit of a change of pace from this morning and from what you'll see later this week. And as Jess reminded me, and I've already forgotten, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Patrick Rafter. You'll learn more about me tomorrow. I'll be on tomorrow's panel as well, session 3A in the morning. But yeah, I'm at UC Irvine. Okay, so without further ado, we have Ken Buesseler to talk about that long title there. Let's go.
Thanks. And yeah, Ken Buesseler from Woods Hole. And I came to this title just trying to think, what can I bring to this group? And I'm kind of at the upper end of the age curve. Maybe I'm not the last one there, but there's a few of us who were around during the early iron experiments. So I thought that has some bearing on this. What did we think of MRV? What were we doing? So I'll talk a bit about that. Obviously CDR, and then kind of bookend at the more recent times. I was part of that Academy's panel that got me thinking 20 years later about all the different approaches. And I like the idea we're not picking on any one here, because that report, as you know, came out with a research program for all of them, all in all the time. But as I put that title together, you know, I couldn't help realizing that what I call monitoring, reporting, and verification, I think ARPA-E calls measurement, reporting, and validation. Does it matter? I mean, our group started talking about that. We think there are some differences. So we hope we leave this week with maybe at least an understanding what I mean when I say that. CDR, I think we all know, but sometimes there's an O or an M in front of it because of the oceans. Ocean iron fertilization, sometimes there's an A there because we're talking about artificial or deliberate purposeful additions and the academies. So I just thought that was kind of fun. We're not really using real words anymore. So the arrow down, I'm getting the arrow across. This arrow. That one. Cool. So the outline is really quick. Back in the day, what were we thinking? A little bit reintroduction to the Academy report, and then some more current status on things like our technologies, the need for models, and what we call a code of conduct. So back in the day, I was a student sitting on the floor in Woods Hole in 1988 when John Martin quipped, you know, give me half a tanker of iron, I'll give you the next ice age, right? And so he was really thinking deep about the geological history, the changes of CO2 and what drove that. Yes, geoengineering was kind of a motivator. That quip certainly alludes to that. But really what we set out to do was look at the limitation of plankton growth by conducting these open ocean field experiments. The dates there, 93 to 2004, just to remind you, that's a map of nitrate. And so in the high nutrient, low chlorophyll regions, we set out to see what would happen. So we didn't think of MRV. I have a small v there for verification. You know, we came up with what we all do really well. We had peer-reviewed publications. We sent those out. Our peers looked at what we did. We had multiple people measuring the same things in different techniques. That kind of worked. It's a slow process. There were many other things I could have put on here, but many working groups, international, national reports put together. The media got hold of some of this. We wrote our own op-eds, and we had consensus statements about what's next. That's really where we're at. Or maybe that's obvious to the academics in this room. That's how we do our work. So it's not that big a step. It's slow. It's not motivated by a market, certainly, but it's a way to build consensus around what these types of activities would do, the consequences of putting iron in the ocean in this case. And it's important to realize, you know, when we went to permit those, we didn't have to have an MRV plan. The very last German experiment, they got caught up a little bit in the politics, the Convention on Biodiversity. They had to do an assessment. NSF didn't require us for this for funding. We had a science questions and we had how we're going to answer them, MRV, right? We also weren't selling a single carbon credit from this in these experimental runs. So I think certainly there's a success there in the science, but between the public and our peers and markets, it probably didn't move it very far forward for CDR. You might know that. One of the reasons, too, though, that I kept seeing at that time, companies would come out of the woodworks 2002. That's Russ George standing on Neil Young's yacht, photoshopping in some red plume and saying he can solve our entire climate problem with iron. He goes to the Vatican and hands out a piece of paper to the Pope who says, you are now carbon neutral. I mean, there was a lot of bad behavior, and partly because he got away with this without doing a single MRV. He did not have the ability nor the interest. He just wanted to make a quick buck. Oceanos, you could argue, was very similar in 2012 of Hideaway, promising enhanced fisheries if they added iron. So around those times, we were putting together things like this. You know, we thought it was premature to be really selling these profits or carbon offsets until we had the foundation to evaluate those risks and efficiencies. So I think that's something that came up in our little breakout group just now. There's other reasons for MRV, and one is to stop this kind of bad behavior, because that really set us back. People really question the science now when they saw this kind of behavior to the public. It's all the same, right? We're a bunch of crazy people putting iron in the ocean and saying we're going to solve this global problem. So 20 years go by, and I was asked by Scott Doney, this is my kind of COVID project, all done remotely, amazingly, to look at 6 different ocean CDR approaches. I have the names of the authors on the next slide, but basically you saw these earlier. How do they differ? How are they similar? We came up with 300 something pages. This table does not do it justice. I've got another slide. I'm going to highlight a couple things, but basically you took all of those 6 things, put them into columns. We wrote chapters and came up with a consensus on, you know, what's the state of the knowledge, what's the efficacy, durability, scalability, a lot of things we've been talking about, why we need MRV. And there wasn't a single one that came across always 3 stars next to it, like, this is great, we've got to move forward. And that's partly why, as a consensus report, we said, we really got to close these gaps and do studies in all of these areas, R&D, in each of these approaches. And there are more, by the way. You guys know there's more than 6 ways to do this. That came from the charge we were given by ClimateWorks. They set the stage. This is more to this meeting's focus. So that table goes on, cost of scale up. Some are low, ecosystem iron, we put a lower cost. But those next 2 rows were the way we were thinking about the larger kind of MRV needs. And I think it's a little different than the emphasis this morning, but it included this idea that, yes, there's a challenge to account for the carbon efficiencies, the amount of carbon you might sequester, how durable it is in the ocean. But this environmental monitoring, I think many of these approaches really kind of ignored that side. We were hit over the head of that with iron because we thought it might cause a harmful algal bloom or create dead zones, oxygen dead zones. People were immediately asking these types of questions, but it's going to happen with all of these, right? You grind up mineral, put in the ocean, there will be ecological consequences. You grow seaweed at scale, you're shading, you're using nutrients, there's ecological consequences. So we kind of punted on that, but I think that's kind of probably lost on most people, that we just kind of said, okay, well, it's going to be needed for anything that we do in the oceans for CDR. So I think that was an important lesson for me anyway, is that we have to think of that. And I hope for this group that we get more into the environmental side of MRV. I think that's quite important because that's what's really going to sell this to a public and make people think that the consequence of doing this is acceptable versus doing nothing, right? We're already geoengineering the planet, and what we're trying to convince people is what we're doing will lead to less harm and suffering for humans and the environment. So that takes looking at that environment. So I've got 3 slides. You already heard Simon was up here talking about ARPA-E. This came out of their request for input. You know, the goal of that program is really related to the CDR industry financial values, carbon markets. Those are keywords that I was seeing in June. The way they want to do that, you heard, so we can go pretty quickly, is look at, sensing platforms and models. Yes. I guess Simon told me he can't announce yet that this is going to happen. We were told that this program would be on the scale of $30 to $50 million, motivated by carbon markets, risky ideas. But it was also interesting. It was kind of like BY, is Simon somewhere in the room? I wrote that down. It was like BYOCDR. So they're going to develop technologies, ways to measure the carbon, but you need to be part of an experiment, a field experiment. How are you going to know it works? And so what I also want to kind of stress to this group is I think we also need to think about moving forward on those experiments, right? You need to have something happening in the field that you bring your technology to and try to improve upon it. Sort of like, I think, the way the land-based stuff has worked. Some of these towers for the gas exchange, they're part of an experiment, a field experiment. So we can't just do MRV in isolation of deliberate field experiments to look at the consequences of any of these CDR approaches. So I think it's more than just the measurement. At that meeting, I talked about technology. It's great. We're going to hear more about that. I just want to point to one of these, which is a camera system that Heidi Sussex runs that does a really good job of separating down to species level, the plankton, zooplankton, things that would be caught in several liters of water with what's now a towed instrument that can be put on a long-range AUV. So there are new technologies that might allow us to do that. People in the room might know about things like eDNA. More classically, it's nets and bottle incubations, right? Those are often harder to do than just measuring CO2 or counting particles. Some of the other technologies here are more about how many particles are there, how fast are they sinking, how much carbon are they carrying. Those are also needed. But we have technologies. We hope some of that moves ahead. It's very essential. One thing you probably haven't heard about, Jenny Edgecombe, Adam Schubach, Drew Nicholson at CU, but we were all part of a team at Woods Hole that was challenged, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, to come up with something that Peter DeMedical and Rector called the Ocean Vital Signs Network. And the goal of something like this, it really fits in nicely. Unfortunately, we've written a 15-page report that's going to be released probably in a month or two to fill in some of the gaps. But the idea is, what would it look like on a notional scale to be able to track carbon flows, top of the ocean to the bottom, bringing in the ecosystems, that's what the vital signs is about, controls on that whole carbon cycle. And really, it's not motivated just by CDR, but by changes in the natural system. How would we know? And the idea is to scale something like this. Let's say it's off the New England slopes there with thousands of kilometers on the side, so we can actually have a more pervasive presence, nodes where you would actually have permanent equipment, top to bottom power supply, right? That's what we call superstations. This is all TBD, right? We're still trying to get money for it, but actually we're finding a lot of philanthropic support for this idea. Gliders moving up and down, and then things like one of the images on that technology slide, Minions, cheap $1,000 devices you can put in the ocean and measure carbon flux pervasively, sort of like Argo slope, but much cheaper and more distributed measurements of carbon. So that's something hopefully you'll hear more about. It really has a lot of in-water collection with autonomous vehicles, ships, yes, and then equal emphasis really on what do you do with the data, how do you distribute that, what type of models would have to develop to take advantage of something on this scale. So this is a dream, but I hope several of you can be part of it. Models, moving right along, I think we can't do MRV without models. And this is just one example that I think is pretty good since we talked a lot about durability. But if you believe Dave Siegel and others, they think if we can get carbon down to certain depths and locations, that the return time for that to the atmosphere to impact that would be on orders of, say, 100 years, depending on where you are, at 500 meters, to several hundred years up to a millennia. It's not permanent. We tend to use the word durable, but I think we know these return times pretty well. He's not the only one who's done estimates like this. So my last couple of slides, I want to talk to you about a group. OceanIron.org exists now in the last 6 months. 60 odd people from China, Australia, EU, US, Canada, thinking every month about, well, what would we want to do for responsible research? What would that R&D program look like? And so we've put up a website with basically the motivation for why we need CDR, why the oceans, why iron might be beneficial. And then we're coming up right now with the priority research plan. But one of the very first things we did, Margaret Leinen had really been active in this area, is set up this code of conduct, which I realize now really has that fourth bullet that is really MRV. And what we wanted to say as an umbrella group of scientists is we should move forward, but let's follow these sets of principles. You'll notice the first one, this is for the collective benefit of humans and the environment. We're not doing it just to make a buck, right? That's not our motivation. Maybe someone will, maybe that's how you get the markets to grow. I have nothing against that, but this motivation for research is about number one, we need to have governance responsibilities. We need to commit to open and cooperative research, and then this assessment, iterative and independent, and engaging the public. And before, this is my last slide, I promise, 30 seconds. You've heard that I think it's really important that groups like this talk about that. AGU is talking about the ethical guidelines for climate intervention. So it would be nice if we all had a single code or set of responsibilities. I think we could agree on that. We feel we need these larger, longer experiments that are, they're hypothesis-driven research. We should be comfortable with that. But also these field sites then become test beds. You bring your favorite toy, and if we know this is going to happen in 2 years at a certain place, why can't others come in and try their new technologies, right? So within these self-contained field studies, we hope that that happens. And then the last one here, I've really seen that the social side is really going to be important, getting the public back on board, getting governments, agencies, markets develop governance structures, right, for the ocean commons. So it's going to take some sort of public market acceptance. That to me implies you need MRV. We're going to have this governance, ways to permit this and manage risks. MRV, how do you do that without knowing what you've done? And then I think that last one, that's more my pet peeve. People often think that the experiments are going to be something we have to limit because they're going to take us to a point we don't want to be in the ocean. I really think this plan has gone so far that we've got to move ahead. These experiments are not permanent. They're not altering regions of the ocean. We should get ahead so we get enough information 5, 10 years to make intelligent decisions about CDR and climate intervention. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ken. We'll save the questions for the panel. And next up, David Koweek from Ocean Visions.
I feel like I've really graduated at my first OCB meeting. Heather and Sarah Cooley tasked me with running around the microphone so that everybody could be captured for the online audience. So now I actually get to stand in front of the microphone myself. So really glad to be here and to join all of you. I'm Dave Koweek. I'm the science director of Ocean Visions. For full disclosure, I draw a salary, health, dental, vision, PTO, and holidays from Ocean Visions. So disclosing the relationship, if any of that sounds good to you, you should come talk with me about opportunities. Okay, so if you don't know, Ocean Visions is a relatively small and relatively new nonprofit. We seek to work in a catalytic capacity, which means we work with a network of partner institutions that span universities, research institutions, as well as civil society partners that are needed to scale solutions. We work on really critical problems at the ocean climate nexus, and we made a big push around accelerating the research and the development of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. So that's what I'd like to speak with you about today. And in particular, I'd like to speak with you about the value of accelerating the research and the development of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal as a means to build a base of evidence around MRV. So my talk is going to pick up on some of the points where Ken left off, and hopefully we'll provide a nice segue into Freya's talk. Okay, so R&D before MRV, you know, there's, I think, two fundamental challenges here. The first is that ocean ecosystems are really complex. You all know this is an OCB workshop. There's lots of carbon fluxes that are going on here. So we need to understand the transformations of carbon when you perturb these ecosystems. What are all the various pathways? What are all the various inputs and outputs, et cetera? And the second dimension of this problem gets at what Ken was talking about, which are environmental impacts. And so, you know, I think we have to think really critically about, whether the M means measure or measure and monitor, and think through some of the implications of that. So for instance, if you're only considering CO2 uptake, it becomes a planar measurement. But if you're thinking about ecosystem impacts as well, you have to monitor an entire volume of water. The problem is more easily constrained if you're only interested in a single variable, CO2 flux, and perhaps less easily constrained if you're thinking about environmental impacts, which can take on sort of a numerous, any number of dimensions. You might have fewer stakeholders on board if you're only focused on carbon flux. If you're only focused on pumping as much carbon into these ecosystems as possible, you might not get buy-in from some of the other marine stakeholders. Whereas if you're focused on avoiding critical marine ecosystem thresholds, you might get more buy-in from some of these other folks. And then there's, of course, the associated cost estimates. So I think we really have to wrap our head as a community around what it means when we say the M in MRV. At Ocean Visions, we think that controlled field trials are the cornerstone of a well-developed research program for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. And so there are other dimensions of well-designed research programs. These include observational studies, lab and mesocosm experiments, numerical modeling, and literature syntheses. But we think it's absolutely critical that the R&D for ocean-based CDR includes controlled field trials. So when I say controlled field trials, I mean fit for purpose perturbations in marine environments that are designed to monitor biogeochemical and ecological responses by making measurements before, during, and after. So you have to be able to quantify that additionality of the experiment, and that involves knowing the counterfactual. But if we do this, if we have a whole series of controlled field trials, then we build up a base of evidence. And so we need a lot more than one field trial for any one of these technologies. But together, you can think about the value of this base of evidence. So you build up all of these controlled field trials for all these various technologies. That allows you to get a really good handle on what are the important fluxes and parameters and sensitivities of the system. And that allows you to operationalize a really strong evidence-based MRV framework that integrates models and measurements. So in the next part of the talk, I want to share with you some of the things that Ocean Visions is doing to accelerate this R&D agenda. I think some of you might be familiar with the fact that we've released these online living digital roadmaps for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. These are really designed to be living documents and also to focus energy on what have been communally identified as the most important knowledge gaps that need to be addressed and first-order priorities for addressing those gaps. We are about to build a new map that's going to be focused broadly on microalgae CDR pathways. So that includes ocean nutrient fertilization. It also is going to include shore-based technologies that use the power of microalgae for cultivation and carbon sequestration. It's sort of within our ethos to make these as open and democratic as possible. So we invite everybody's participation and attendance, and you can sign up online to get the details. Many of you might know that for the last year or so, I've been leading about 25 individuals, evenly split between academia and industry, to co-develop an agenda for global research around understanding the efficacy and impacts of sinking seaweed for the purposes of carbon dioxide removal. So this report is in press. It's going to come out in the next few weeks. Some of the people who are involved in that are in this room. And this report does several things. It identifies all of the key fundamental questions and the principal and secondary scientific methods associated with answering each of those questions. It provides really detailed guidance on how to execute controlled field trials for understanding hypotheses for both the surface ocean and the deep ocean. It provides cost estimates for individual field trials as well as for a global research program. We're going to include an accompanying budget tool that would help experimentalists plan for these field trials, and then a list of oceanographic assets, infrastructure, and pilot projects that can be used to accelerate progress here. We've also been partnering with a number of organizations to run RFPs, or requests for proposals. This is a really powerful model for stimulating interest, enthusiasm, and innovation in the field, because it gets a lot of people excited. And even if you're not successful at winning, you have sort of a ready-made proposal to go to the next funder. So about a year ago, we partnered with the ClimateWorks Foundation to administer an RFP around natural analogs for ocean-based CDR. Alex Gagnon from the University of Washington is the lead PI and one of the winners, and Adam Subas is the other lead PI. And we're also working with additional ventures and a suite of philanthropic partners to administer RFPs around the science and engineering for ocean alkalinity enhancement. So like I said, this is a really powerful model. This is something that we're going to continue to do at Ocean Visions, and keep an eye out for some opportunities that are going to be coming down the pike in the next several months. We're also doing some work to build an enabling framework for R&D. And so it's not just about doing the science and the engineering, but it's also about creating the enabling political and social structures that allow that science and engineering to take place. So we've given support to the Sabin Center, which is at Columbia Law School, to design some model laws that could be used to create facilitative conditions for doing R&D for ocean-based CDR in federal waters. And as part of this project, they'll also design some model laws for some key states. You can't do it for every coastal state, but for some of the key states, they'll be doing that. So Ramani Webb, who many of you know, is the lead there, and we're really looking forward to that work. Ocean Visions has also worked with Wonder Strategies for Good, which is a communications and mindset mapping firm. They did a lot of really incredible pioneering work on understanding and advancing legalization of gay marriage. And we worked with them to understand how ocean and climate leaders, both in the global north and the global south, are thinking about ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. And this work is still underway, but one of the main takeaways is, that people realize that solutions are needed. They realize about the power of the ocean. Many of them are open to understanding and advancing the science of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. But this was one of the really key takeaways, that scientists are really powerful messengers, but you have to be honest about the environmental risks, and you have to be honest about the environmental concerns. None of these ocean and climate leaders that we polled wanted to have anything sugar-coated. Okay, so I don't have too much more. Just in these last few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about what I think a research program looks like as we all move forward together. And so in the top here, I'm trying to show you an example of stage-gated research. So I think in order for us to move forward, we have to move forward conscientiously to develop hypotheses, to execute on controlled field trials, and to evaluate the hypotheses, or to evaluate the hypotheses using the data collected from those controlled field trials. And I think what's really important here is that there are stage gates in this research, so that if a hypothesis is invalidated, that we stop the research. If it's validated, you move on to the next technology readiness level, but that we don't end up in sort of some continuous iterative process where we're constantly chasing an answer, no matter how difficult it is to find the evidence. For any of you who are familiar with the Pastures quadrant model, I think that we really need to be working here, sort of in the Edison and Pastures quadrant, and far less in the kind of traditional fundamental or discovery-based science module. And I think most importantly, I'm writing, we need to avoid becoming ocean iron fertilization version 2.0 here. And what I mean by that is that we can't do experiments now that 15 years from now, we're going to say we're not fit for purpose for evaluating key hypotheses about efficacy and impacts for ocean-based CDR. So we need to do experiments now that answer more questions than they ask. I think that's going to be really key for doing science that can inform policy. And then in this last slide, I just want to touch on what it means to move forward on all of this together. And I think this is really critical. This is one of the most diverse audiences I've seen at an OCB event. And I think that the future of R&D for ocean-based CDR is going to look really different than how we've traditionally thought about R&D, in the sense that it's not going to only be coming from university researchers and national labs and then trickling its way into the private sector. Many of the folks who are sitting in this audience are involved in cutting edge technology and science development in the private sector. Some of you hold positions where you both sit in the private sector and you sit in universities. And so I think we need to focus collectively a lot less on who is doing the science and much more so about how the science is being done. So what hypotheses are being tested? Are they being tested in ways that allow them to be invalidated? I think that's really key. Is the research being done transparently? Does it facilitate outside scrutiny? And is it being done in an inclusive, just, and equitable manner? And I think if we do all of those, we'll set up a really strong and rigorous science foundation from which to develop operational MRV frameworks. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, yeah, well, we will, let's just hold our questions till the end, to the panel at the end. Next up is Freya Chay. From CarbonPlan, and I would recommend walking around that way because there's too many wires here. That's the same aesthetic.
Hello. My name is Freya Chay. I am really happy to be here and really happy to learn from a lot of people who know more about the ocean than I do. I work at a nonprofit called CarbonPlan, and we are broadly interested in supporting transparency and scientific integrity of climate solutions, with a particular focus in the last couple of years on carbon markets and carbon removal. I have worked personally both on the more traditional carbon market oversight research we do, so thinking about where in carbon markets you see really big gaps between what the market is claiming and what we know about best available science in forest and soil sectors. But I also have done a lot of work trying to support high integrity conversations about the role of emerging approaches to long duration CDR. Today, I am hoping to talk a little bit and share a couple of thoughts about how this community might consider the intersection of big scientific uncertainty and carbon markets. And I'm going to do that in 3 parts. I'm going to start out with a couple of definitions that I have found useful for thinking about this space. I'm going to share a couple of key takeaways from a recent collaboration we did with a leading buyer of long duration CDR named Stripe, where we worked to kind of map uncertainties across different CDR pathways, including marine CDR, and think about how those uncertainties might be incorporated into their purchase process. And last, I'm going to pose 3 questions that I think it could be really constructive for us to chew on together. And I'm also going to click in. There we go. So we have been using this term, but as David and Ken both referred to, MRV can be kind of a nebulous term that we throw about, and lots of people use it to mean lots of things. So it could be defined, just the acronym, as measurement, reporting, and verification, monitoring, reporting, and verification. The V could be validation. It could be MMRV, measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification. I think there are important nuances in that language, but at a very basic level, I think the goal that is being invoked when people point to this acronym is trying to figure out a system for producing trustworthy quantitative estimates of real world outcomes. and communicating those findings and the methods on which they rest in a consistent and transparent manner. Hat tip to Matt Long, who shared that definition with me first. I think it's a really good one. MRV might also have context-dependent goals. So we have mainly been invoking MRV and talking about carbon markets, where MRV is a system that supposedly mints trustworthy carbon credits that can be used in carbon accounting to make claims about the climate. But you can also imagine MRV supporting other goals. So Savita is going to follow up with some talk about federal investment in this space. And you can imagine systems of MRV not trying to mint carbon credits, but trying to support clear and transparent learnings about other goals that are not perfect credit carbon accounting ton-based goals. So actually, I'm not going to touch this slide. I'm going to zoom out for a minute just to re-emphasize something that Simon brought up this morning. Just a quick hierarchy of carbon market space. Very broadly, we talk about conventional carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets. Conventional carbon, not conventional, compliance. Compliance carbon markets are carbon markets in which participants are regulated. So there are rules about what they need to do and who needs to participate and which carbon credits are allowed or good enough to be counted in that space. The rest of everything, voluntary carbon markets, are unregulated. You have systems for MRV that exists, you have standard setting bodies, but everyone is participating voluntarily. And in the voluntary carbon market, as Simon showed this morning, most of that is not carbon removal. Most of it is avoided emissions. There's this tiny, tiny slice of carbon removal. And if you zoom into that slice of carbon removal, most of that is short duration carbon removal. So promises to store carbon, usually in forests or soils, on the order of decades. And then there's this even tinier slice that's just emerging that's about long duration carbon removal. So taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it on a time scale that is commensurate to the impacts of fossil emissions. So when I am referring to marine CDR here, I am referring specifically to marine CDR approaches that are in that long duration carbon removal bucket that are likely to result in carbon storage that lasts thousands of years or more. Sorry for the digression, but I think it's some useful situational awareness. So marine CDR and carbon markets. I'm talking about ocean alkalinity enhancement. I'm talking about macroalgae sinking. They're really just entering the carbon market. A couple of points that I think are interesting for your situational awareness if you haven't been playing in this space. One, we see a lot of new entrants with a lot of different approaches and a very wide range of scientific uncertainty or grounding around their approaches. I think largely because of the interest in marine CDR and the presence of scientific uncertainty around these approaches, I think we're seeing some really fascinating emerging conversations about the strategy and potential trade-offs we might make as a global community around uncertainty, cost, and scalability of different CDR approaches. And marine CDR is right in the middle of that. The tons of long duration CDR that are being transacted right now are primarily being transacted in the absence of established MRV standards. So you see bespoke quantification approaches and ad hoc verification of outcomes by really, really motivated buyers. That's not a system that scales. It's worked all right so far. It hasn't been a barrier to kind of getting this space started, but clearly we're gonna need a different system in the long run. And to that point, I think there are fascinating open questions about how long duration CDR approaches, including marine CDR, will or will not interact with the existing voluntary market systems for MRV. Folks like Charm, Nora spoke this morning, have decided and really clearly articulated that they don't see the incentive structures or the quality guarantees in that existing system that they find sufficient. And they're interested in a new type of system to emerge. You see other folks, some DAC, long duration CDR approaches, for instance, direct air capture. Thank you, Patrick. Really looking toward existing standard setters to give them guidance on MRV. So I think it will be very fascinating to see how this system unfolds and where marine CDR approaches decide to fit in. One of the really prominent challenges of the existing voluntary carbon market is that although all carbon credits ostensibly represent a ton of carbon, we know that in reality, they represent very, very different interactions with the carbon cycle. And we call this a non-fungibility problem. All tons are not equal to tons. And I think there's a very clear consensus in the community around long duration CDR that we want to avoid that problem. We want to end up in a world where tons from direct air capture can be directly comparable to tons from ocean alkalinity enhancement. But there are big questions about how to get there. And that moves me into kind of the second portion of this talk. Motivated by the wide range of maturity in approaches and tools for measurement and monitoring that we know exists across different CDR approaches, CarbonPlan collaborated with Stripe, a leading buyer of CDR, to try to more systematically map quantification capacity and uncertainties across a handful of CDR pathways, including ocean alkalinity enhancement and macroalgae sinking. This process involved a lot of input from a lot of people, including folks in this room. Thank you. And what we tried to do was really think at a pathway level, so at a CDR approach level, about what the process was and what components in that process really must be quantified to get a good estimate of either carbon removal outcomes or durability of storage outcomes. So this is an example diagram for macroalgae sinking, where the macroalgae growth and sinking doesn't involve a harvest step. And the components we identified for quantification are all of the little numbers. And we spent a lot of time gathering input on how to characterize the uncertainty associated with each of those components. So for each component, we asked a couple of questions. We asked, how impactful is the uncertainty here? How much could it change your final estimate of how much carbon you removed or how long the carbon is stored? We also asked, whose responsibility should this be? Is this something that the carbon project really needs to measure or monitor directly? Or is it something like air-sea gas exchange, which probably your run-of-the-mill startup is not in a position to estimate with integrity or with the best available tools we have? And last, we asked some questions about kind of the type or flavor of uncertainty. So is it an execution uncertainty, which relates, like, can be drawn down by careful deployment of known tools, or is it a big scientific uncertainty where we really need more R&D to bound our uncertainty more effectively? Just as another example, this is the rough sketch of OAE with direct alkalinity additions. And these are actually kind of a living interactive tool. You can drill down into all of the uncertainties. It's on our website at CarbonPlan. Again, a living document, your input is welcome wherever. The goal here is really that it provides a boundary object for both projects and buyers and scientists to be talking about which pieces of the puzzle need to be improved and how we should think about uncertainties in the meantime. So we rolled up for each CDR approach our analysis of how ably we can quantify and estimate key outcomes into something that we called the verification confidence level. So for what we call closed systems like direct air capture, where you can just measure almost every piece of the process, you can measure how much CO2 is coming off the machine and how much CO2 is injected to storage. You can quantify things quite ably. You might notice that oceans, unsurprisingly probably to you, have a lot of open questions. It is hard to quantify these key outcomes. And something that is not reflected here that I'm sure you also know well is that on that far low confidence side of the spectrum where you have low verification confidence levels, we also have more uncertainty about the uncertainty. The likelihood that we might just be missing a piece is much higher. So building on that foundation and picking up where David left off, here are a couple of roles that I see for quantitative contributions from the people in this room and beyond. David talked about research and development. In my mind, that's really about clarifying the efficacy and safety of different approaches and improving our ability to quantify key outcomes on an ongoing basis. So in other words, in my mind, R&D helps us shift these bars to the right. But we also need ongoing MRV. So once we have passed a threshold where we think an approach makes sense, we need a way to quantify outcomes on an ongoing basis. These approaches are going to participate in a carbon market. And that's really making sure that a given project doesn't fall off the end of its bar. It is performing and measuring and monitoring to the best of its ability. In the last couple of minutes, I want to introduce a couple of questions that I think the scientific community could provide some really important guidance around, and that I have been chewing on as a result of this project. And they're largely governance questions. So given the current state of uncertainty, my first question is, how should we differentiate and communicate about project and system level MRV responsibilities for different marine CDR approaches? Where do we want to clearly say, hey, project, this is not in your ballpark. This needs to be done by, X scientific body or X agency, because it's really important that it's done right, and it's going to be hard for you to do. Relatedly, what role is there for proprietary methods in each of these buckets? What transparency expectations do we want to collectively set? Governance question 2. In the meantime, given the current spread of uncertainty across different CDR approaches, how do we fold in uncertainty into the concept of a ton? If those tons are used in carbon markets to make carbon claims, we really have to reflect uncertainty in what actually happened. Governance question 3, and last one. How should we differentiate between ton mode and exploration mode? So in my mind, ton mode is, yes, this approach is ready to produce an asset that someone else can buy and say that it cancels out their fossil fuel emissions. That's a high bar. Are there marine CDR approaches where we want to say, hey, we're not there yet? It's really important to explore here. It's really important to do R&D, but no, we can't buy and sell tons from this yet. And relatedly, are there trade-offs we are collectively willing to make as a scientific community as the market approaches these CDR pathways between uncertainty, potential for scale, cost, and environmental non-carbon impacts? All right, that's it. Thank you so much. Excited for the rest of the conversation.
All right, that was another great talk. Our last talk is Savita Bowman, going old school. So yeah, once again, hold your questions till the panel, which will be immediately following this.
Hey everyone, doing things a bit old school today, no slides, giving you a break from all of that, and just going to be talking about a couple key concepts and movement federally that's going on with Marine CDR MRV. So it's great to see you all in person. It's my first time here in Rhode Island, and as I'm sure for a lot of you as well. Nice to finally have these in-person interactions. My name is Savita Bowman, but you can call me Savvy. So before I get into my talk and kind of covering the federal landscape, I kind of like to spend a second talking about ClearPath, what we do and why it matters. So ClearPath, we're a DC-based nonprofit, and we work to develop and advance federal policies that reduce emissions in the energy and industrial sectors. So we work on white space technologies like nuclear energy, carbon capture, geothermal, industrial decarbonization, and last but not least, CDR. So you might be asking yourself, if you're not super familiar, what does a policy nonprofit really do? It's kind of like when someone tells you they're a consultant, you're like, what does that mean? Well, we work to understand what are the barriers to deploying a technology and how can we focus on crafting the solution? Is it that federal funding needs to be allocated to an agency, or do we need to direct funds towards a specific objective and initiative? Or maybe the technology is ready for prime time and now we need to commercialize it. So something like a tax credit could be helpful in catalyzing the technology's transition to the marketplace. Another side to what we do is educate lawmakers. For example, a lot of folks are asking Congress to drop in millions of dollars on ocean CDR and MRV, rightfully so. But Congress doesn't know what it is or why it's important. So what we do is help them get smarter on what the topics are and what this very specific term means. So we get in there and explain why this is a good use of taxpayer dollars. Therefore, when they're asked to vote on something in committee, they know what they're talking about, because members and staffers work on a lot of different things like healthcare or defense, and they're not always directly related to ocean CDR. So moving on to the topic at hand, MRV. I won't speak to the private sector or the science, since we've heard from a lot of really brilliant people on this content. But what I can do is speak to the progress in the federal agencies and policy and where ClearPath forecasts roadblocks and opportunities. So as Ken, David, and Freya mentioned, MRV can mean different things to different people. Driving this point further, the M in MRV is sometimes referred to measurement, other times monitoring. So getting a little bit more alignment on what MRV as a total definition is crucial, especially when you're looping in policy. Academia and science is looking at a whole of system point of view, whereas private sector and federal agencies are evaluating on a per ton basis the value of the solution as it pieces into the climate matrix in the market. And something I'd like to note is that the private sector is operating on an ad hoc basis in lieu of guidance from federal agencies or regulating bodies. So though there's work being done on the federal level, it's just starting out. So what really has been done on the federal level? As you heard this morning from Simon at ARPA-E, which is a very highly effective federal agency, by the way, with the ability to research cutting edge solutions, they're working on MRV. He covered it in his spiel, but they've been looking into long range autonomous new CDR MRV technologies and ocean climate model interfacing for MRV. Policy wise, the catalytic piece to CDR and ocean CDR was the Energy Act of 2020. This is a bill that expanded work at the Department of Energy, amongst a lot of other agencies, to research various CDR pathway solutions, including ocean CDR. This was the first update congressionally in 13 years to climate policy, federal policy on anything climate related or energy related. Then this catalytic event that happened in 2020 led to a resulting couple other bills, including the infrastructure package and now the tax package that recently passed. The DOE, after the Energy Act, then launched their carbon negative shot as part of their energy initiatives or energy other shots initiative. Hydrogen was the first one, then they had long duration storage. And for those of you unfamiliar with this program, They basically work to accelerate transformational technologies to the market. So it looks to advance CDR pathways that will capture CO2 at gigaton scales for less than $100 per net metric ton. And this initiative is actually currently working to develop an understanding of MRV of all CDR solutions, because MRV for direct air capture is going to look very different than direct ocean capture or any other ocean CDR mechanism. So they've been holding a series of workshops to better have a grasp on all the different types of ocean CDR that exist. How do we map out the boundaries? Freya did a really great job on her slide talking about what those boundaries are. And everybody I know is going to be talking about this in talks to come. So I'm excited to learn and get all this information. But there has been a large focus at the federal level on MRV, and they're starting out. So exciting work, definitely collaboration needed. On the legislative side, there has been assistance provided through specific bills. So the Carbon Removal and Emissions Storage Technologies Act is a bill that does three things: expands R&D, provide technical assistance, and purchasing structures for CDR. The bill itself provides resources for carbon removal metrics and evaluation, MRV. And lastly, what I'll cover is appropriations. Now, I know some of you, this is your first time hearing this word, and some of you know this very arduous annual process, but it essentially is a process that happens congressionally yearly to fund federal programs. Now, I know a lot of you probably know the Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a bill. So legislation is one part of it, and it's a very important part because it directs funds or directs agencies to look into certain things. But the other piece to that is appropriations, and that's where the appropriations committees come in, because they fund all of this activity. And that's really important. If we want to get any of this work done, we need money. So the important thing to note here is that historically, there's not been a huge focus on CDR, but that's changing. And in FY23, so fiscal year 23, there was actually direction included in the appropriations language to look into ocean CDR. On the House side, it encouraged the National Science Foundation to prioritize research into carbon removal, including ocean carbon removal, and provides funding resources for geologic carbon sequestration on the outer continental shelf. On the Senate side, the National Oceanographic Partnership Program was given resources to continue to facilitate interagency and public-private partnerships to advance ocean science research, development, and education, and was allocated funds to work. I won't say the number because the Consolidated Appropriations Act hasn't been released yet, and so it's not finalized, but they were allocated resources to work with other federal agencies and industry partners to develop, test, and evaluate ocean-based carbon dioxide removal technologies. So there is direction. The House and the Senate also provided DOE language to prioritize the development and improvement of accounting frameworks and tools to accurately measure carbon removal and sequestration methods and technologies. So this direction was also written in for DOE. So this kind of gives you a little bit of a look of what's been going on the federal landscape. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about the roadblocks and opportunities that could be coming up in the next couple of years. So different federal swim lanes can make it difficult to mobilize technologies. In this case, Marine CDR has a lot of different agencies involved in the matrix. DOE has historically done a lot of the RD&D work, so research, development, and demonstration work. And NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is well positioned to focus on that final D, deployment. This is their purview. Collaboration is definitely necessary, but it's challenging when you have things like MRV that require the R&D pieces and the testing pieces in situ, and then layering in another piece to that is EPA. They are the regulating agency that permits a lot of this work. And currently, there's not a lot of clarity for ocean CDR permitting work. DOE and NOAA can cover the MRV during testing. However, the main roadblock is that permitting is not authorized for in-situ testing for marine CDR. This can be addressed a couple different ways, but just to give you an idea of why. So Currently, legislatively, you're not allowed to make major changes to the pH of the ocean. Growing seaweed and letting it sink to the ocean floor is currently considered a form of ocean dumping, and so is not permitted. And so if any of us in this room today are going to see a difference in the marine CDR deployment space, we're going to need to address this very specific challenge. So permitting can really limit the scale of how much CDR is done. And as David mentioned, a lot of R&D is needed before the MRV. But if we're even going to get to that point, we need to be able to test in ocean climate, in ocean situations. So a couple opportunity areas. DOE and NOAA have a public-private partnership resource to address these challenges. So a bipartisan bill was actually introduced in July last year, the Partnerships for Energy Security and Innovation Act. And then it passed in the CHIPS and Science Bill. And it basically creates a nonprofit foundation for the US DOE that channels research and innovation to higher education institutions and private sector partnerships in alignment with the mission. So the foundation would build on previously successful models for public-private partnerships and facilitate commercialization of technologies like Ocean CDR. NOAA also has the National Oceanic Partnerships Program, or NOP, as was mentioned before, and that is another lever to facilitate some of this transition for public-private partnerships. And lastly, I'll say this because this has been brought up quite a few times today throughout discussions, and I'm really excited to continue these discussions, but there are data needs. A lot of us have been talking about modeling and modeling the impacts on the ocean, but models are only as good as the data that they have. And currently, a lot of the information is either not consolidated, not transparent, hasn't been updated in years. And so a lot of the data needs to be refreshed in a way. And so in this sense, AI and big data can really help model the impacts. And then with that, a combination of in-situ testing should be rolled out. So the marine CDR community is poised to set the right standard now. Waiting too long may result in technology lock-in of one solution that might not even be the best solution. So to ensure we get the results, there needs to be transparency, collaboration between federal agencies and the scientific community, steps to address permitting challenges, and quick and clear next steps to implement on MRV. So I would highly recommend alignment within the community and making sure that there is a good understanding of what we mean when we say MRV before trying to codify this into law, because that is the law. It becomes a big deal and it's not changeable. And once it's passed, it's very hard to change. So this will avoid the space becoming heavily opinionated, polarized, and potentially resulting in inaction or atrophy. So the one info bite I'll share about the private sector is that CDR has raised over $2.3 billion in private sector investments since 2020. Microsoft, Stripe, XPRIZE, Shopify, Frontier, all of these organizations have been spending money on CDR. And to make sure that Ocean CDR is part of that mix, we need to make sure that we address a lot of these challenges. So right now, opportunity-wise, there's bipartisan, administrative, and federal agency support for this work. So let's make sure that we get MRV squared away.
All right, thank you, Savvy. If I can invite our participants up for the panel. We're gonna have the panel up until 4 o'clock and then a break. So now's the time for those questions. Yeah, so Ken, Dave, Freya. Savvy, yes. Okay. Okay, yeah. So I'm just going to go straight to the panel with sort of some themes that I'm seeing emerge. We're seeing uncertainty and how to quantify it as being very important, perhaps something that will definitely go forward to the working group. But then another question I had was the MRV of, you know, for quantifying carbon versus MRV for markets. And so this came up in our earlier discussion. I saw some of it here today. What do you think about that, panel? So it's not really a question, I'm sorry. So one of the themes I'm seeing is we can think of MRV as sort of being something that scientists do to, or whoever is doing to quantify the carbon uptake versus I've seen this talk of, you know, the MRV of the markets and this being a different thing. Is that true? There's my question.
I can speak to that. Could be, or it could not be. I think it depends how you set up the system. So certainly carbon markets are very interested in an MRV process that produces quantitative estimates of carbon removal specifically. We probably want that MRV system to also consider non-carbon impacts like ecosystem impacts to make sure people aren't doing crazy things and selling it on the carbon market. How that intersects with ongoing science that is also interested to quantify outcomes, I think is kind of the open question. Does that speak to the theme?
What does the rest of the panel think?
Does it depend a little bit on, you know, who's going to bring this, like what do they care about? If it was just a company that's selling a widget, so
Speak
if
up a
you're
little.
selling a widget, you need to how much carbon did you sequester? If you're trying to, as a governance or policy body, impact climate in a beneficial way, then you have to do more than that. So really, who's going to have control over this emerging market really will probably determine what you really have to do under this M, right?
The one more thing I might add, which relates to governance, is whether or not it's a challenge that is quantifying an outcome in a single point of time or over a 5-year or 10-year experimental period, or whether you are trying to quantify outcomes on an ongoing basis from like a whole range of approaches or projects like you might see in the carbon market. I think those require slightly different angles on the question of quantification.
So while we're talking about this development of MRV systems, maybe we should flash back to our talk number 2 with the provocative subtitle of "Cart Before the Horse." I think there wasn't even a question mark. It was just a statement.
I think it was putting the horse ahead of the cart.
Putting the horse again. Okay. Okay. Would you like to expound on that?
Well, in this case, the analogy is that the horse is the R&D and the cart is an operational MRV framework for buying and selling carbon credits.
Okay, so you don't want to. So where does MRV fit into that? It's not in there. I saw the main title was R&D before MRV. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, the point of the talk, I was being a little kitschy with the subtitle, but the whole point is that a really robust MRV framework requires a really strong evidence base of empirical science. So there's a lot of theoretical science, and by theoretical, I mean, you can generate models all day, but when I'm talking about empirical observations of natural systems, observations of field trials. And so I think we need a really strong evidence base there. And that helps us establish really good MRV protocols that can address questions about carbon quantification, its associated uncertainty, and non-carbon impacts.
Patrick. Okay, so let's go to the audience. Thank you.
Hi there, this is Richard Dewey. I just had a question. I think it was Freya you had mentioned, and I'd like you to expand a little bit on it, on the time frame that may be required to call it, removal, CDR. And you hinted at, we don't want anything less than 1,000 years. And on marine CDR, I don't think that's been determined at all. That I would argue from a zeroth order perspective, anything less than 1,000 meters is decades to a century. Deep water may be a century. So when you say our metric is 1,000 years, is anything on the table at the moment then, or could you clarify that?
Sure. So just to put a point on that, I think carbon removal of all durations provides us different benefits, different climate benefits. In carbon markets, people are trying to use carbon credits to make claims that fossil emissions are canceled out. And we know when we burn fossil fuels, we're moving carbon from the slow carbon cycle to the fast carbon cycle, and that creates impacts for literally millennia. It's a very, very long tail. Yeah, I think that's fairly well proven that you have this like stack of responses and equilibrations that last at the tail end for, yeah. Oh, sorry, no, I'm talking about when you emit fossil CO2 into the atmosphere, the impact lasts for millennia. Yeah, sorry. So if you are a buyer in the carbon market, you're trying to buy a credit that you can use to claim that your fossil emissions are canceled out. The time scale of storage really matters. It doesn't pass the laugh test if you say that carbon credit represents 10 years of storage. Like, no, that's no way. You know, for things that turn CO2 back into rock, you're talking about similarly long time scales. That's like, okay, great. For things in the middle, like perhaps sinking biomass in the ocean, like biochar, where you have this mid-range of something that's obviously longer than decadal scale, if you, for instance, sink biomass to depth, but is not permanent, it's not back to rock. I think there are some questions about how we want to value that. But generally, when I talk about long duration CDR, I'm talking about that kind of natural schism that is between the super short stuff that we see in forests and soils, which is usually 10, 20, 30, maybe 100 years, and approaches that have potential for a categorically different storage duration. I think there are other people in the room who could certainly speak to the circulation dynamics better than I can, but my understanding is past certain depths, and that is a very big, like important, point of characterization. And depending on where you sink biomass, you could have relatively long time scales of carbon storage, up to 1,000 years plus.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to get a question to either Ken or Savvy. Anyone in the audience have that? We have a hand up right here.
Can I add one thing about duration really quickly? You know, I mean, these issues about century to millennia, they might apply for biological based pathways. For ocean alkalinity enhancement, there's pretty strong understanding about why you might exceed 1,000-year duration for carbon removal.
So I have a question up here, specifically related to the notion of fungibility. And I think, you know, fungibility is this interchangeability between carbon credits, but it strikes me that there's another axis on many of the CDR deployments that entails ecosystem effects that might have co-benefits or damage. And I'm curious whether there's, you know, I was recently exposed to an idea of selling biodiversity credits, you know, and quantifying biodiversity as sort of an aggregate metric of the capacity of an ecosystem to continue to provide services. But it seems to me that this might be an opportunity to sort of explore, you know, to cover new ground in the context of an MRV framework and criterion. So I was just curious if there's thoughts about that, because it sort of is in some sense antithetical to fungibility, or at least the definition of fungibility needs to be expanded to incorporate new elements.
I mean, when I think about this, is that seems like we have a lot of uncertainty in the benefits, you know, and negative consequences, right? And so I don't like to hang my hat too high on like the fisheries benefit of nutrient enhancement, because we really haven't been able to show that. Yet theoretically, the base of the food chain, there's more productivity, you increase the higher trophic levels, right? So there's some basis for saying, well, things will change, but when you go out and try and sell a technology saying your salmon return in 2 years is going to be great, that's almost impossible to demonstrate. So I said I didn't want to hang my hat on. I'm not sure how far we want to go selling benefits that we can't measure. Now, maybe someone has a clever way to do that. Same way, though, that some of the experiments have been kind of halted because of potential harm, that if you get pseudonatia, the diatoms that produce domoic acid that can cause HABs showing up, that we automatically assume that this will happen as a consequence of large-scale ocean nutrient enhancement, in that case, iron. Certainly, we don't see that in natural systems that are iron enriched and in low iron areas like the Southern Ocean or volcanic eruptions. So the jury's still out on some of these things, but just because it can happen doesn't mean it will happen.
I might add, just in the market context, one, I don't think there is a good framework for trying to fold those into some comparable thing. In the conventional carbon markets, you see ecosystem and community co-benefits often used as an excuse for not being careful on the carbon accounting side of things. So if we do go down that path, I think it's really critical that we are careful about how those two worlds interact and or justify each other. One approach I have heard advocated for is just keeping them separate. So just like renewable energy, for a long time, we were selling the kilowatt hours and we were also selling the renewable energy benefit as its own thing, which is kind of crazy. There is a possible separation in CDR land between the carbon benefit and the other stuff that is going on, where the ecosystem impacts or benefits could be a gating mechanism to whether or not an approach can participate in the market, but doesn't directly affect the asset.
I have a question for Savi to clarify.
I'm sorry, could you please say your name first?
Oh, sorry. Ajit Subramaniam, Columbia University. I have a question about the permitting aspect, because this is something that has bothered me quite a bit, especially because folks seem to be jumping in and doing things. So do I understand you correct that right now EPA has the permitting control, or we don't have a legal framework for permitting as it stands?
So currently there's lack of clarity on who the controlling agency is to allow permits. I know EPA has been receiving requests for applications for ocean testing. However, NOAA is actually the jurisdictional entity for a lot of this work. And so there needs to be a lot of collaboration, and there's a lack of clarity right now on that regulatory framework. So one of the paths forward, if you think of like what's next, is the federal agency providing that clarity of like talking to each other and then coming to the public and saying, this is how the process works, and this is what we can currently do, and this is what we can't do. And if there is a legislative block, that's where you come in with bills to amend current legislation to provide those pathways forward.
Do you have any sense for the 312, 200-mile extents in terms of whether states will have a role in this and how they are sort of discussing state boundary from federal boundary to economic zone boundary?
Yeah, I'll say that state law is not my specialty. However, ocean permitting, typically because it's a shared space, is more of a federal permit rather than a state one. But I do know that there's coastal level permits that are on state levels that you can do for like local projects. But I'd imagine for something like marine CDR, it's likely that it's going to be a federal allowance.
This seems to get to David's horse and cart issue, because we really need to get this straightened out if we're going to do.
I'll just say, you know, that was the whole motivation for funding the Sabin Center, to develop this federal model law, so that, you know, you create the conditions that make it much easier to do responsible research in U.S. federal waters. And I'll say that our friends over at Additional Ventures are working on setting up a series of pre-permitted test sites around the world, again, so that, you know, if you meet a series of sort of checklist conditions, your technology will be permitted for field trialing, to try to make it much easier for scientists and technologists to try out their ideas in the water.
Nice. We have a question from the Zoom chat. So from Nelson Polgarin, which is the limit for a company to claim carbon credits? I actually saw a company trying to quantify the CO2 whales capture to be able to create a market for it. triple exclamation marks. So is it the limit of okay? So I mean, let's just say, that's the question.
I'll actually take a quick stab at that. I always go through the additionality test as my litmus test. Is it something that was done and someone did out of the way of a traditional process that would normally happen? So whales capturing CO2 is like saying, the plant that I'm growing at home is capturing CO2 and I should assign a value to that because I had this plant and it's capturing CO2. So.
And although that sounds absurd, this is an unregulated space if you're talking about a voluntary carbon market, and you can claim whatever you'd like. There's something that is not a joke, surprisingly, that's about breath-based offsets. So yeah, there is not really a limit, although I think there are emerging efforts to try to, from the buy side, limit what claims you can make with certain kinds of offsets to try to exert pressure on this unregulated market to differentiate its credits and incentivize high quality outcomes. Those efforts are very nascent and complicated.
Anyone else? Okay, question from the audience. Just please announce your name first.
Yeah, Leonard Bach, University of Tasmania. So this question also relates to Freya's talk, but I think the question's relevant for everyone. So first of all, thanks. What you do at CarbonPlan is fantastic. I really like the stuff you're doing with the latest stuff with the ranking criteria you're building there to kind of get a bit of, so order in the mess. But so I really digged in deeply into this and looked into it, and then I started to wonder, because how did you get to these uncertainties? Because every now and then I was like, yeah, that sounds good, but here I disagree slightly. So the question I'm having is, if you set the uncertainties and you kind of set the ranking criteria, you function as a regulator, but who regulates the regulator?
A classic question. Thanks for the kind words. So just for clarity, that's an ex-ante characterization that was really relied on a lot of input from scientific experts, from practitioners in the space, and feedback is welcome on any of the components. So if you see something that you think there is evidence for a different uncertainty bound, feedback is more than welcome. We hope it's a living document. In terms of who regulates the regulator, this is a question of epic proportions that will kind of always exist. So in the existing voluntary, and just to be very clear, we are not trying to be a regulator nor a registry. In any case where uncertainties are actually going to be incorporated into the idea of a ton, for instance, when Stripe/Frontier is actually buying things, they're using that template as a way to solicit information from projects. But there's a major question about where the right uncertainty numbers should actually come from. Should it come from the project? Should it come from a third party? Big governance and system design question. But back to your question, who should regulate the regulator? In the voluntary market, we're seeing really, really fascinating dynamics right now where the registries, so the independent standard setters who have been developing crediting roles for the last couple of decades, have come under a lot of criticism for creating a market in which it's really hard to tell what is quality. And so you see new emerging meta standards who are trying to give out, I said earlier, gold stars to the gold star givers to tell the rest of the market where to look for quality. And you can kind of imagine that kind of cumulative standard setter evaluation of the evaluators problem playing out in lots of ways. And I think the question is, like, what system do you set up with the right feedback so that doesn't have to happen? I don't have an answer to that yet, but I think it's an important one.
And I'll actually just quickly add, on the federal agency side, the more you are able to take part in these workshops that they hold and they're able to collect this data, the easier it will be for them to figure out what this should look like before it actually becomes a requirement and a law, sort of like
this is now the regulatory landscape and this is the way quality will be assessed. So it's good to get in on these conversations now so that you can be part of the way they think about this rather than later on once it's too late.
Thanks. Question from the audience. Your name first.
Yeah, this is Han Jiwen. I have a question. I think you may cover this topic a little bit. So I know this workshop is not to triage any CDR approach, but eventually, how do you decide? Okay, we want to like don't use this CDR approach anymore. What's the threshold when you decide we want to move on? We want to give up, for example, iodization or seeking QID and seaweed. So I want to hear more about this. Thank you.
What I was trying to mention in my talk is that, you know, we need to come up with really clear testable hypotheses around efficacy and impacts. And, you know, it's really hard to sit here and draw the line and say, I think these are David Koweek, think these are the impacts that we should say are critical and can't be crossed, or I think David Koweek, think this is the efficacy level of carbon sequestration that we should attain, and anything below it is not acceptable. That's a societal conversation, but I think that there need to be really objective metrics and hypotheses to support those metrics that can be validated or invalidated with a properly designed controlled field trial, right? So if those experiments are designed well, you can quantify the fluxes or you can quantify the ecosystem impacts. And I think it's that process, that iterative process, that will allow us to down select from the big funnel of technologies that were listed in the NASEM report. And I think if we follow that structure, we will ensure that we collectively end up with the most efficacious and safest technologies.
Just another point to this. I mean, some things like when we looked at, you know, blue carbon in the open ocean, and people thought, well, this is what's wrong with helping ecosystems to store more carbon, but it might not be a climatic solution, but we do it anyway, right? I think that a lot of these things on these lists, you know, even if they aren't going to solve a climate problem, might move forward if there's a net benefit, seems like, for ecosystems or something like that. In the same way, when markets come out, if you can make a buck on 100,000 tons of carbon removal, that will probably happen unless there's a environmental backlash or an agency that stops you from doing that. So partly what I think we need in the science is just to say, what are those limits? Where could this be effective? Where shouldn't we be doing this? What times of year? What ecosystems are the most sensitive? So we can kind of put some bounds on it, maybe like fisheries, right? We accept taking protein out of the ocean because we want to eat fish. We don't do it effectively everywhere. We've destroyed some fisheries, but we have fisheries science to help make the right decision. Will we make the right decisions? Time will tell, but certainly I think we need enough information to kind of explore that, because the alternative is this planet with the climate crisis we're in, and we want to try everything we can to get out of it, right? Now, maybe not quite an answer to that question, but I think it's important to realize there's different reasons for doing this.
So, oh, there are more questions from them.
Hey, Tyler Rohr from University of Tasmania. I already kind of talked about this with Freya a bit in our breakout, but maybe for the others. I'm wondering what you think about the dichotomy between MRV from kind of a proof of concept perspective, like the 20 years of iron fertilization experiments we've been doing, versus MRV from a appropriate compensation from an individual project perspective. So for iron fertilization, if it was ever happening at scale, presumably we aren't going to send 2 ships in an eddy and 50 scientists with every deployment to get the same level of MRV that we had at the proof of concept stage.
I mean, certainly for any of these, you want to reach the point where you don't have to send the ships, right? So models, maybe some remote sensing and a floater, to backed by earlier research studies, allow you to extrapolate what's happening from a much smaller set of observations. And so if we can't get there, it is probably going to be impossible, right, to have $50 million of ocean scientists in the water to get 100,000 tons of credit or something like that. So we definitely need to move in that direction. So that's why this early stage is going to cost us something, and kind of challenge the group earlier. You know, it's more than just technologies and getting MRV set up. We've actually got to just get in the water and do these things. Start getting that data, getting those observations so we can reach that point.
Thanks.
Okay, question from the Zoom chat. This is, I'm guessing, directed to Savvy. The MPRSA, does this ring a bell to you? Because it doesn't to me.
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
MPRSA.
No.
It's a okay, so I'm not going to ask that question. Because I didn't know what it was either.
Unless the person who asked that question would like to expand on the acronym.
Yeah, hopefully they'll write in the Zoom.
Okay.
Any questions from, I saw a hand up. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Zachary Johnson, Duke. My question is, we've talked a lot about MRVs and we haven't really talked about what we're measuring. And my question is that presumably a lot of that is carbon. That's just one aspect of a full life cycle analysis. And so what I'm wondering is, from the panel, how essential will a full life cycle analysis be? Will there be life cycle analysis light? Will it not be done at all? And we'll just think about carbon. What are your thoughts?
Very important, because there is actually legislation circulating right now that essentially evaluates net tons. And so unless we have an LCA to determine what the net ton value is of a removal, we're not going to be able to mobilize that policy. So LCA is very important.
So let me clarify my question. I wasn't just referring to carbon, but also health impacts, environmental impacts, a whole broad range, and a full LCA. So not just the carbon.
That's a little tougher, just because I think, to an earlier point, assigning a value to intangible pieces to life, like ecosystems, can mean different things to different people. This kind of takes me back to a cost-benefit analysis I did years ago, and the value of a human life, that's very subjective. And the value of an ecosystem is very subjective. So getting a lot of those pieces built in would be very tough to do, legislatively and market-based, but not that this work shouldn't be done, not at all, because of course we need to understand the benefits and the impacts to ecosystems. There are benefits, and making sure that we advocate for those will be important.
For you though, what I heard in that, thinking about the cost, is the energy cost to deliver, say, something to produce electrochemically, some alkalinity change or shifts like that, because I think that's definitely part of the discussions in all of these. Are we going to produce nitrous oxide that offsets a CO2 removal effect when we add fertilization in the ocean? Things like that definitely need to be at least part of these R&D stages. So maybe we can check them off the list because they're not important, but many of them still need to be done and part of that.
I might add one more layer, which is, so in addition, as you said, to CO2e net carbon removal accounting, I think people are thinking about what the right way to think about water use and land use and community impact and environmental risk and all of these things are. And right now, I have mainly seen people talking about that coming to play as like maybe a tech neutral incentive structure that says we care about all of these dimensions, and the better you can score across all of them, the more funding you will get. I would say there's not an established framework to bring all of those to play, but there's an active conversation about their importance.
Speaking of which, question to the panel, the M in MRV. Should we decide on one or the other, monitoring versus measuring, or do we go MMRV? And so this is in reference to a Zoom comment. Thank you, anonymous Zoom commenter. So yeah, do we choose one or both?
Capital M monitoring. I think it's more than just measurement. So you can use your M and M, but to me, measurements are part of monitoring.
I know, Dave, Dave, you were the one that I think first spoke about this during our pre-meeting meetup, and I was intrigued.
Well, I mean, I have to give some credit to Matt Eisenman, who said, they use measure, monitor, and model. And Matt Long has said that, does it mean, measure, monitor, model? So I don't think we're going to solve this here. I think if we had this is going to be a question that repeats itself throughout this session, throughout this workshop, and going forward. But I think it's worth thinking about what it means to move beyond CO2 fluxes alone.
Adam Sabash from WHOI. A lot of this conversation really feels very US centric. It's a very kind of capital driven way of thinking about this problem. I'm wondering how that sits with the fact that this is a really global issue and there are players that are not coming from the same perspective as us, and how that feeds into the international conversation around where this is going to happen from a permitting, legislation, and ultimately like a carbon market and trading perspective.
I'll jump in here to share a little bit more, Adam, about some of the work that we did with Wonder Strategies for Good. It didn't touch on permitting, but when we surveyed the global climate and ocean leaders from the global south and the global north, one of the takeaways that Wonder had was that, the leaders in the global south were far more amenable to testing new technologies than were some of the ocean and climate leaders in the global north. And so I think the evidence from their work for us would suggest that there might be more of an appetite to try some of these technologies than we might think.
I'll also add that I've spoken to tech developers personally, and they have mentioned that the complicated regulatory landscape in the US has actually made them move to other countries to look at deploying their solutions elsewhere. And true that the net benefit will be felt by everyone all over the world, but that does make a big deal when we're trying to keep a lot of this investment here in the US and catalyze a lot of these solutions here in the US.
I might just add, I'm not at all convinced that markets are the right way to scale these things, especially to gigaton scale. And I think there are some really interesting folks like Holly Jean Buck talking about public governance models. That stuff is hard, but I think it's worth all of us in this space keeping a pulse on alternatives to making this all an asset and treating it.
Okay. One other question from, sorry, let's get a question from the Zoom chat. So given the international nature of this work, can you explain the imagined process that standards for carbon credits that are not just held by the USA or North America, but become international, perhaps even through the UN? Like what process would you imagine that could be?
So right now, the voluntary carbon market is international. It is not bounded to the US. A lot of projects are happening all over the world, especially in the global south, which introduces its own set of difficult questions about equity. But setting that aside, yeah, voluntary carbon market, not at all constrained, very international. UN has, there have been international efforts at carbon markets before. They are hard. They have to intersect with country level claims about carbon outcomes and country level accounting. So I have no idea what it actually looks like, especially if you're talking about a global compliance system to set an international standard, but in the voluntary market, it is unbounded.
In our panel, we talked about getting it endorsed or metrics endorsed by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. And that way, if they're reporting it in their major releases and recognizing and acknowledging that as an accepted climate mitigation strategy, that might be one way to elevate it to a real international level.
I certainly think IPCC reports did that just for the idea of carbon removal generally, and the idea that net zero structure requires abatement first and then permanent carbon removal for residual emissions. That was a huge deal. When it comes to standards and crediting standards, the devil is always in the details, and it seems like there will have to be another forum for that.
I just wanted to follow up on the question.
Just to remind you that, please say your name before you.
Ajit Subramaniam again. I just want to follow up on the question before, and I do not know if this is outside the panel, but I am curious to know if any of you can comment on what international lenders are doing in this space in terms of the carbon market. I'm very specifically thinking about climate colonialism, where the smallest countries are the ones that are paying the biggest price and yet are completely savaged by loans. And so just curious to know any movement that is in that particular space in terms of carbon credits and what they might do for mitigation on their side, since everybody wants to go to the south where there are no regulations.
There are some meta standards like PCAF that are trying to talk about setting up guardrails for the financial sector.
Sorry, the PCAP?
PCAF. I cannot tell you what it stands for, unfortunately.
PCAF.
But this is not my particular area of expertise. Generally, I think, you know, there are questions. You could imagine the financial sector either interacting with the carbon markets in terms of funding carbon removal activities or in terms of trying to make carbon claims around net zero goals. Those sometimes intersect, and I think there are really tricky questions about how you put guardrails on that accounting. But I think that conversation is just beginning.
I'll just add that you do make a very, very good point on the colonialism piece. And I think that driving down the cost here domestically in the US is going to play a key role in deploying these technologies internationally as well. Just because if it's $2,000 a ton for CO2 removal now in the US, it could be so much more in other countries. But if we maximize, deploy, commercialize, and get to a cost point that's feasible, and then we export the technology and package the solution for someone to just pick up, that could be a segue. And as for financial institutions, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with any that are working on this particular thing. But I'd imagine that's one way to provide that solution. And also carbon removal inherently is a solution for all, because everyone will feel the benefit of this.
Galen McKinley, Lamont, and Columbia. Yeah, I have a lot of questions. I guess the one I'll ask comes from the, you know, the verification side at the scale of the global carbon budget, right? So presently, global carbon budget is released every year with large uncertainty bounds on it, many tens of petagram uncertainty in each sink. And the carbon credits that are being sold on the land, you know, have no relationship to that, right? So at some point, if we really move down this road, we have to also be saying, how did the global carbon budget change because of the integrated effect of all that we're doing? And that's got to be part of this verification piece, right? They can't be unhinged, right, from each other. So when does that happen? How does that happen? How do we move in that direction?
I feel like we should toss this question to David Ho.
That's tomorrow. Well,
I think you have a
yeah,
mic,
all day
though.
tomorrow is basically focused on that thing. I mean,
Yeah.
sorry, on.
Yeah, but I think that, I mean, I'm talking in the panel tomorrow because that's what I do, but I want to know from the people who
Okay, sorry.
who regulate, who are interested in sort of the finance and regulation, all this side, like, how does that happen? How do we get there?
I can tell you that there's almost zero conversation about that in the carbon market.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yep.
But not that it shouldn't be a conversation. And I think that's a good point to raise.
I think one thing to think about is, you know, there's this really nice dashboard, CDR.FYI, that shows the state of all the carbon removal companies. And, you know, to date, something like 13,000 tons have been removed. And so we're really far from being able to see that show up on a global carbon budget. And I think you have to keep your mind on 2 points, like the horizon, what you're saying, and then also the near term, that if you spend so much time thinking about solving long-term problems that you're not going to solve the immediate problems that are at your given level of technology readiness. And I think there's a somewhat of a tension or a balance that you have to manage there.
Yeah, I guess the point I would make is that, you know, the uncertainty that we talk about, if it, we need to include the uncertainty in the tons, but if that uncertainty includes zero, the potential that we're not doing anything, you know, we need to avoid getting into that space, right? And I totally recognize that it might be 50 years from now before we can say this effect happened, but we need to be thinking about how these pieces intersect along the path.
So David Ho from University of Hawaii. I'm wondering what happens to ocean CDR, or is that marine CDR, if we don't figure out MRV?
We don't get very far, do we, right? I mean, clearly that's quite the answer. I mean, I think I'm just keep thinking though that we've got to get some of these things going to see what we need to MRV. What are the primary things? How are they going to change? What are those chemical species? What are the ecological consequences? And you build your MRV with that information. It's almost like we're sometimes stepping back and saying, we need MRV first. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, without MRV, we can be doing what you have done, experiments to understand how the ocean works in response to alkalinity, electrochemical alteration of something, or iron, right? And then from that, if you want to build a market on that, that might take a different type of technology that you transfer into from that science base. I'm not sure you need MRV before you do that field work. How about that? But that we need the field work first to build up an MRV plan.
I'll add, David, I don't think this is a presence absence question. I mean, you know, I think that there's momentum in this field, and people will develop MRV systems. What we're talking about is trying to optimize that for the common good. And, you know, so let's just focus on that. I think if that doesn't happen, people are going to build ad hoc MRV systems that are befit or, you know, bespoke for their purpose, and those may or may not have high quality levels.
Sorry, we need to, for the Zoom audience, if you could speak on a microphone.
I'll repeat, he was saying people are just going to go ahead with it.
So when I said MRV, I didn't mean all the side effects and the efficacy. Well, more about the efficiency, I guess, you know, because ultimately what you're selling is how much CO2 you're removing from the atmosphere, right? So if we go ahead with it without figuring out that part, like what happens?
You get another episode of John Oliver.
That was a good episode, though.
There's that. And I'll also just add that, you know, on the terrestrial side, we've seen examples like direct air capture succeed without MRV for like a year or two. And now MRV is coming into the picture. So if we think about that in the context of marine CDR, I could imagine a world where if MRV didn't exist, something like electrochemical separation of CO2 from seawater, where there's a direct product of CO2, would be easily sort of deployed, because there's that product of CO2 that's tangible. You store it away, it's out of the way. But for processes that require a little bit more calculation, like seaweed sinking, like alteration of pH and such, there might be a little bit of undervaluation because MRV is not there. Does that help answer the question?
I have more questions. But...
Okay.
Yeah, Leonard Bach, University of Tasmania again. Building upon David's question, what happens if we're not figuring out MRV? I mean, it's very likely that we won't figure out MRV, right? So I guess the question to you is, what is the level of uncertainty we can live with and then go ahead? And I mean, do we need to prepare policy, the government, and everyone involved about an uncertainty level? I guess, yeah, it's a question.
I agree, that's the question. Yeah, I'm curious what you mean when you say we won't achieve MRV. Like if it means we won't achieve something that looks like DAC, like, yeah, I think a lot of CDR approaches will not be you know, directly mutable. They're open systems and they are complex. So in that case, I would say strong yes, that I think we have to be thinking about building uncertainty into our consideration of what is achieved and our comparison of different CDR pathways, such that we can kind of price that uncertainty in and make investment decisions in the big picture accordingly.
Yes, so I mean by uncertainty, I mean we're not going to trace every CO2 molecule into the ocean, right?
Nope.
So what is the level that is acceptable? Do we just have to have a good feeling about it and say, okay, it's likely going to be, or is it like 95% certainty, 99?
I guess my knee jerk, although I think it would be really interesting to get everyone in this room talking about it, is that if you feel, even if there are large uncertainty bounds, but you are confident in them and they don't intersect with zero, we can do discounting around that. But if you are not confident in those bounds, or if they intersect with zero, then you maybe have some problems and we probably shouldn't be counting tons.
Okay, so what you need from us is upper and lower bounds. Okay.
I had a question. I'm sorry.
Quickly, I thought it was interesting, the hurricane models we saw earlier too. I mean, that's another way I think of uncertainty, because we're going to need models to extrapolate really for MRV, because we're not going to measure every atom of CO2. So I think what we might need to move to are get the modelers to give us those different estimates, and that puts the uncertainty bounds on this, right? Either the amount that's removed or how durable it is. So without models, we won't know. Without multiple models, we won't have uncertainty. And then we need the observations to inform those models.
And one more thing is that the models are the only way to project forward in time, because some of the potential effects are going to happen after the time that the action takes place, right? So if you, as an example, fertilize the Southern Ocean and then nutrient rob from someplace downstream, you need models to help you account for that.
As we're entering the last couple of minutes, a final question maybe for the whole panel. So my take from the talks today is that what probably will happen is we'll have large field trials and we'll have an ongoing development of MRV. I forget who said that, maybe it was Freya. Does that hurt us to not have this well-defined MRV that, from a policy perspective, from a stakeholder perspective, from, a variety of perspectives, to not have a set in stone MRV? And if so, then maybe we should wait until we know exactly what we want. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there are lots of ways. I'll just choose one little part from your question, is like, does it hurt us? I think the thing that hurts us is not telling the truth about where we're at. So even though there are large uncertainties, I think it is trust building to be straightforward about those and incorporating them clearly. And that is just the current state of affairs. So the best we can do is speak really clearly and honestly about the current state of play to facilitate investment and priorities that help us get to a better state of play over time.
I'll say also, from the policy perspective, if policy is built and designed to be too prescriptive, it's not good policy. So we shouldn't be implementing too much specificity and being too prescriptive in general. And so when coming up with this MRV rubric, I think the learning by doing model will need to happen, just because of all the conversations we've had today. It's not going to be a fully packaged ready solution tomorrow morning. So there are some gives and takes. I do see some difficulty if it is implemented or incomplete when implemented and there's changes later, but I think that's just the way the learning curve is going to have to go. We have to have something, or otherwise we're just going to reach this atrophy that I mentioned earlier.
I want to say learning by doing is the perfect way, I think, to put it, and also realizing that different CDR approach will take a different MRV. So to say there's just one way to do it doesn't even fit the 6 or 12 things that we've been talking about here today.
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess my last thought is just that we all need to move from the theoretical where we sort of sit around and talk about this and model this and project it in idealized space or project it in unidealized space to the empirical where we go out and we test these ideas and we subject them to rigor in a transparent way, in a way that's inclusive. And that allows us to shoot down bad ideas and keep developing good ones.
All right. So for everyone watching online, if you did not hear a name attached to a good question, that was me, Patrick Rafter. So I apologize. I was supposed to introduce my name as well. Do we have time for a final? Is the audience ready for a break? Okay, it looks like it's break time. So I want to thank the panel for all of your great thoughts.